Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. President, Madam Ambassador, dear guests, thank you very much for joining us. A warm welcome from Istituto Affari Internazionali. A very warm welcome also to the many people who should be connected in stream with our meeting. They are much more outside than inside, don't worry. First of all, thank you very much to Focus 2030, our partner in this initiative. It has been a great collaboration, a great relationship with Focus 2030, and many thanks, of course, to Compagnia di San Paolo and to Centro Studi sul Federalismo that also worked a lot with us to implement this project. Now, our issue is simple and known. Let's say simple. As you know, we have many low and middle income countries that are facing increasing challenges in managing their debt burdens. This is an obstacle to the development of the most fragile areas, and it is a phenomenon that generates negative impacts also on wealthier nations. The public finance situation of these countries, primarily located in Africa, has worsened significantly due to a combination of recent crises, such as COVID-19 pandemic, the inflation crisis triggered by Russia's aggression against Ukraine, the ongoing conflicts in several areas of the world. This crisis have increased, in some cases, the financial distress of several countries and severely jeopardizing the provision of even the most basic public services. Multilateral organizations and fora have rolled out interesting actions, such as the G20 Debt Service Suspension Initiative, launched in 2020. And they have provided certainly useful initiatives, but such projects have so far perhaps delivered only limited benefits. So many African countries today still spend much more on servicing debt than on health and education. And these fragilities need to be addressed, of course. There is a smart mix of possible innovative measures, such as the so-called debt for development swaps. From this perspective, by converting debt into investments in specific projects, the governments of more vulnerable countries would not only reduce their debts, but would also be obliged to allocate the financial resources to programs that can improve the living conditions of their citizens. To discuss all this, and I'm ready to give the floor to Mr. Paolo Gentiloni, President Paolo Gentiloni, who gave us the honor of his participation to this meeting. We welcome today a group of internationally well-known speakers. I appreciate very much the presence of the ambassadors of South Africa. And first, we are honored to welcome for his keynote speech President Paolo Gentiloni, former European Commissioner, former Prime Minister of Italy, former Foreign Minister, and we as professional diplomats tried always not to complicate too much his life when he was at the Farnesina. And currently co-chair of United Nations expert group on debt. We are very interested to hear your ideas on the actions which are possibly to be presented as solutions, and we look forward also to the next important meeting, which is the fourth International Conference on Financing for Development in Sevilla. Following that, we will have a panel discussion moderated by Daniele Fattibene, who is an associate fellow of Istituto Affari Internazionali and coordinator of the European think tanks group. We will hear perspectives from the ambassadors of South Africa in Rome, who is holding the G20 presidency this year, but also experts, representatives of international organizations, civil society organizations, and multilateral institutions. So thank you very much again for being with us today. Thanks again for the hundreds of people who are following us in stream. And I'm very pleased and honored to give the floor to President Gentiloni. Thank you.
Grazie all'ambasciatore Valencise. Pleasure to be here in the room, Spinelli room of the Istituto Affari Internazionali. Michele Valencise was referring to the fact that this is a well-known crisis. I would say it is not completely well-known, because of course we know since several decades of the fact that low-income countries are in debt distress. And we maybe remember the fact that in the 90s, a very important initiatives promoted by the Pope brought to a form of debt relief, the HIPC at the time. But maybe we are also accustomed to a scenario where this crisis is no more so crucial. And so I think it's very important to discuss how this crisis is materializing now, why, and what can we do. And so, again, I think dear President Valencise, thank you for the initiative. First, we should recognize the nature of the crisis. In a very gloomy global environment, of course, trade tensions, slow growth, higher and higher for longer interest rates, and the decision about ODA taken in a very abrupt manner from the US aid, but in different ways from different countries. We have reduction of the official aid to development. Even more than this, I think we should all be aware of the fact that the multilateral order in itself is under fire. And the issue has been for several years, maybe for decades, the need to reform the international order, and especially the financial institution of this international order. How many discussions we had about the need to reform the Bretton Woods institution, the IMF, the World Bank. But now the boost to change this institution goes in the opposite direction, to be honest. And the risk is that we miss these institutions as they have been in recent years, despite the fact that we were trying to change them for good. I was in Washington in the last meetings of IMF and the World Bank. I remember how the letter of Treasury Secretary Bessent was received. The very fact that the US Treasury Secretary was confirming the importance of the IMF and the World Bank was received as a good thing. He was asking these institutions to go back to their core business, to forget things like environment or social diversity, inclusion, but reaffirming that IMF and World Bank are important. If everyone was happy about this, this means something about the situation we are in. So this is my first point. The global environment is rather gloomy. Second point is the cost of the debt service is skyrocketing. If we look to the figures, for example, in Africa, the debt service surged 12% per year in the last 5 or 6 years. 12% per year is much more than the average growth in sub-Saharan Africa. And then, as President Valenciano already remembered, there are 3.3 billion people living in countries where the cost of debt servicing is higher than the expenditure for health or education. 50 developing countries spend more than 10% of their revenues in debt servicing. So the cost is at all-time high, and it went so high in a very limited period, in 5-6 years. Why? Main reasons are obvious: the pandemic, the Russian invasion in Ukraine, and the consequences of both these events in terms of food prices, interest rates, and now, for new reasons, a global slowdown that we all see is taking place according to the World Economic Outlook of the IMF and all the forecasts that we have. So the consequences of this crisis. There is a discussion, to summarize the discussion, are we facing a liquidity crisis or a solvency crisis? It's a controversial assessment, and there are, of course, solvency crises in single countries to be addressed. But overall, the main characteristic of the crisis is perhaps a liquidity crisis, because most of the low and middle income countries are honoring their debt. And if you look to the level of the debt in itself, the level of the debt, well, we live in Italy. We are rather expert of high debt. So the African average debt is 66%, I think. In the euro area, it's 91%. Not to say the level of the US, which is going towards 130% in the coming years. Of course, this is a rather useless comparison, of course, because that sustainability is not the same in sub-Saharan Africa and in the United States. But overall, what is happening is that most of the countries are honoring their debt, but to honor their debt, they default in development. And this is the nature of the crisis we are facing now. They are forced to choose between their debt and their future, and to pay the interest of the debt, they have problem with their future. And this is bringing us to a real unprecedented in the last 30 years situation where overall creditors are pulling out from developing countries more than what they are putting in. And this is bringing all the mechanisms of the 2030 agenda, of the Sustainable Development Goals, in a great difficulty. Apart from statistics, you know that statistics now are saying that only 15% of the SDG will be reached probably by 2030. But apart from statistics, we had a period of strengthening of the emerging economies, and we perceived this strengthening in Europe and in the advanced economy, also with consequences. Some of the crises that we had in our countries in blue collars, in middle and low income sectors of the population are also connected to the fact that in many large developing economies, things were stronger, and so the stronger economies brought to export and to crisis in some sector of the advanced economies. But we should start to be aware that this picture is no more there, that the tendency, especially in low-income countries, is a tendency where we are no more in the perspective of growth, and the consequences of this fact will be very serious for all the world, not only for Africa, the small islands, or other part of the world where low-income countries are concentrated. We will have these consequences for the climate transition. We will have these consequences for migration, and so on. So this is also our problem, not only because we want to avoid poverty, children poverty, but also in our own interests to face this crisis. So now we have the conference in Spain, and in theory expectations for this conference should be very low in this global environment that I described before. But the paradox, in my view, is that exactly this anti-multilateral push that is taking place all over the world could bring a counter tendency. So the fact that countries will try to, in any case, reach results in Sevilla. And I have to say this is also maybe not looking only for unanimity in the final communiqué, but looking for results. And by the way, the host countries, Spain, is working exactly in this direction with a platform for proposals that could be shared by countries participating. I think there is a chance to have viable solutions, making step forward in Sevilla. And I saw also recently the final document of the meeting of the African countries' finance ministers. And it's very interesting because this document is supportive of solutions, very concrete solutions. also referring to debt relief to be addressed case by case for single countries, but referring to exactly what the UN expert group is working on. To conclude about this work, and then Penelope Hawkins from UNCTAD, who's here, will be much more on the content of our proposals or to answer questions if needed. I think this group is trying to provide the UN and the UN leadership with proposals that are realistic, if something could be realistic in this global environment, viable, and useful for what we are addressing, knowing that the situation is not the same that we had in the 90s. Even the environment of the creditors is very different from the one that we had in the 90s. You may remember that at the time, what we call the Paris Club, gathering the Western advanced economies, was a major player in all this story. Now the Paris Club is probably 5 or 6% of the creditors. If you look to the sovereign creditors, by large, the main sovereign creditor is China, and no more the Western countries. And if you look to the creditors overall, the main share of creditors are private creditors, and not sovereign creditors. So we have to address this situation. We have three main work streams. The first is to try to reprofile the debt, working on maturities, working on debt swaps, working on conversion in local currencies, a certain number of measures that can help to reprofile the existing debts. Second, we will try to put in place some proposal to reform the so-called G20 common framework, which is the framework that you have to use if you want to restructure your debt or if you are at risk of debt default. This mechanism is there. We are not proposing to cancel it and invent a new one, but we have to recognize that this mechanism is too low and not sufficiently binding for different countries and closed to middle-income countries. So we can have proposal to make this G20 framework more efficient. And finally, proposals trying to increase cooperation among borrowers' countries, which is also very interesting, I think, if we find the right way to gather borrowers' countries to have technical capacity to share different experience. For example, on debt swaps, we have small experience, we can enlarge them, but we need to share these practices. I think we are in a good mood. Final remarks. Of course, when we work in this group on the debt, we are not unaware of the fact that in Sevilla and in the discussion more broadly, there is not only the debt and debt distress. So the whole message is about finance development. That remains the priority. And as Jeffrey Sachs always repeats, the best investment opportunity that today you could have is investing in low-income countries. Not exactly what the big private financial entities are doing, but for sure this is a big part of the conversation that we will have. And the need to conclude to strengthen, and this is why also this meeting this morning in EI is so useful to increase the awareness of the public opinion, of citizens, of media on this subject. I think we have also the opportunity of the parallel track of the Catholic Church Jubilee working on these issues, the fraternity call coming from the Holy See. So I think we have an opportunity in the coming weeks from now to Sevilla to try to put this issue in a rather complicated agenda that we have at international level and also in this country, in Italy. Grazie. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, President Gentiloni, for your keynote address and for highlighting some of the challenges that we are facing in terms of debt sustainability, but also highlighting some of the potential solutions that the global community of experts and member states and international organizations is working on. President Gentiloni will have to leave earlier, so we can collect one, maximum 2 questions for him from the room. Let me also remind people online that via the Q&A function, they can also interact with us, and then we can collect the questions and comments for the final Q&A. So if there are questions from the room, President Gentiloni allowed to address them. So I see one hand. So please, we have a microphone. Please introduce yourself, and then we will give time to
Yes,
President
I'm
Gentiloni.
Marlena Samardzitou from the Ministry of Economy. I was just wondering, in these very nice solutions that you presented, how would you think that the private sector could be more involved? Where can we see in these 3 solutions private sector? Like, do we need more Côte d'Ivoire? What is your point of view on this? Thank you.
If there is another one, I have to clarify that I have to leave sooner than expected because there is a strike in trains. I don't know if you're aware of that. So I have to anticipate my train. It's not because I changed my view. Yes, of course, involvement of private creditors is crucial. Exactly for the reason that they are, for several countries, the main part of creditors. I think we should work in different directions. One is for countries that finally are not able to address the problem and have to go to the common framework structure for restructuring their debt. We have to find binding solutions for private creditors. Not easy. We know that in debt crisis recently we had several cases where private creditors were not following agreements with sovereign, and this was part of an enormous difficulty. Not only vulture funds, but also more traditional private creditors. Find solution to make the common framework more binding for private creditors. And second, of course, given the fact that the number of countries that are near to the common framework is very limited. And the large majority of low-income countries in debt distress have a different crisis, which is a crisis of liquidity, cost of the service. We have to create incentives for private creditors. In the mechanism of debt swaps for development and for environment, we have to include incentives for private entities. The reason why we are so much working on this idea of gathering borrowers in a sort of forum, creating a link among borrowers, is that we have very interesting single and small experiences going on around the world, but they are not transforming themselves in an agreed mechanism. So incentives for private should not be a local solution, but should be a sort of system of incentives that could be provided in case of liquidity crisis. Thank you. I'll stay here to hear the panel. The minutes waiting for the new train.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, President Gentiloni, for also addressing this question. There are lots of hot questions that we need to address, and as you said, the conference in Sevilla is upcoming, so this is really the time to raise awareness and ideas, I would say, to address and tackle these issues. So, as you would said, my name is Daniele Fattibene. I'm Associate Fellow at the EI and Coordinator of the European Think Tanks Group, a network that gathers 6 think tanks based in Brussels, working on EU development cooperation policy and EU relations with the Global South. And I'm really happy to moderate this panel. Some of our speakers are online, some of them are present here. So I will briefly introduce them. I'm really honored to have again with us Ambassador Nosifo Nauskajan Yezile from the Ambassador of South Africa in Rome. We also have Pietrangelo Di Biase, Policy Analyst at USCD, connecting online. Thanks, Pietrangelo, for joining us. Christine Hallen, Executive Director of the Catholic Agency for Overseas Development and also representing Caritas Internationalis. Welcome. Penelope Hawkins, on my left, she's the head of the Debt and Development Finance Branch Division on Globalization and Development Strategies at the UNCTAD. And last but not least, Martin Kessler, who is the Executive Director of the Finance for Development Lab. I will start first with Ambassador Yezile. As it was mentioned also by President Gentiloni, South Africa holds the G20 presidency this year, and it has a huge responsibility also as, let's say, the African voice within this key policy for in addressing and proposing innovative solutions to debt sustainability. I was in person in Cape Town in February at the Financing Commons Summit, and I could see and witness the strong political investment of the country in these topics. So what are the main initiatives and policy solutions that the current presidency is leading on to address debt distress and in general the debt sustainability of low and middle income countries? The floor is yours.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Danielle, and thank you for having me. Not an expert in the area, but again, representing South Africa, and both President Valenci as the ambassador for this institute and President Gentiloni have already given us a sense of characterizing what we face in the context of debt and in the context of the global economic landscape. And I would then get into the South African G20 presidency. And I first wanted to premise my input just indicating and confirming that other sources, including according to the 2024 edition of the World Bank International Debt Report, which has highlighted that the external debt of low and middle income countries has touched a record high of about 8.8 trillion in 2023. And whilst the debt servicing costs are also at all-time high. And I think that the message that we're hearing earlier on from the keynote speeches was actually confirming this. And both, therefore, in this context of the accumulation of debt, which also has occurred significantly during the pandemic, mainly driven by the need for urgent provision of health services and providing economic relief amid sharp declines, both in terms of the economic activities in countries as well as government revenues. And the trend, as I understand it, has continued to persist both in 2023 to 2024, and countries in the South and especially in the African continent have been trying to navigate the post-pandemic recovery to address the mounting development challenges. And this African continent being also identified as the poorest continent in terms of GDP growth, but richest continent in terms of both human capital as well as natural resources. So we have a big challenge, but we also think there are opportunities, and also the trends on inflation increases as well as the instability in food crisis, which are all related to multiple factors. So in Africa, whilst the debt crisis and access to affordable capital is a deep concern, we are also looking at other emerging economies, developing economies, also having some level of challenges, including South Africa. So we are seen to be a middle-income country, but both the issues of inequalities continue to contribute to increased borrowing in our country, and those debt levels are also not sustainable. The G20 Independent Expert Group, already mentioned, established in 2023 on emerging market and developing economies, identified the need to increase investments in resilience, human capital, physical and natural capital, by at least 10% of GDP by 2030, if we are going to really meet the Sustainable Development Goals. And this prognosis, therefore, is what stands as the framing of how we should be dealing with the challenges of today. Of deep concern in Africa is the fact that hunger, chronic hunger, has risen from 7.9% to almost 9.2%. This is now coming from the State of Food Security report produced by the FAO last year, affecting the poor, and significantly the larger population that faces chronic hunger is in Africa. And of course, other regions of the world, in contrast, of course, to Asia, which is about 8.5% and 6.5 people that also face hunger and chronic hunger, in this case in Latin America and the Caribbean. So these are numbers that inform what it means to really address meaningfully development challenges of Africa and other nations. And in Africa, we already heard that our current debt ratio makes it difficult to balance future investment needs within the available resources, especially in the context of current spending imperatives. And on average, President Gentiloni mentioned that we probably sitting at countries, especially in Africa, spending most of their income or revenue in debt service costs, and we're currently sitting at about 16.7% of government revenues on interest payments in 2023-2024 compared to 2010. So when we also had that, again, when President Gentiloni was outlining that almost 15% of the SDGs in terms of the UN report could be achieved by 2030. And this, I've also just compared it with the report that has been produced by UNCTAD in 2024, which highlights that almost approximately 57% of Africa's population, which is almost 751 million people, living in countries that allocate more funds to servicing external debt than on education or even on healthcare. So these are numbers and information that outlines that we are still having a big challenge as the African continent. And the approach of the G20 presidency of South Africa, informed by this context, is taking place. Of course, we know that G20 this year still faces multiple crises, or would be taking place in a context of challenges related to climate change, underdevelopment, inequalities, poverty, hunger, and unemployment, including the technological leap that is also providing some levels of opportunity, but requiring quite significant investments. So South Africa seeks solutions that, again, would be built along the lines of coalitions across all sectors of society, in the interest of course, of our shared humanity. And we have consistently, I think, as a country, put forward the issues of the interest of advancing development and putting forward proposals. In Africa, there was a proposal in 2021 or 2020 during the COVID period in respect of the special drawing rights or the review of the SDRs. And later on, Italy, during its G20 presidency in 2021, as well as during its G7 presidency, put forward good thinking that South Africa supports in the context of debt for food swaps or debt for health, and we now talk about debt for environment or debt for development overall. And these are matters that have been brought out in the discussions from the G20 development working groups, and both from the Italian presidency and the Brazilian presidency. They have found meaning to then align with both the Shepherd track and the finance track. And in that context, we, as South Africa, have established what is called an African expert panel on African debt crisis. This panel is led by our former minister, Minister Manuel, who himself would at least be able to contribute value in the discussions, because in the traditional G20, these are matters that were not taken fully on board in the finance track discussions. And even today, ministers of finance are not keen to discuss development issues. And we hope that the African expert panel would provide both the context of shaping G20's approach to Africa's debt crisis. And we know that G20 is not only Africa, it's the only African country is South Africa, but of course expanded since the G20 presidency of India. We have the African Union participating. So we have quite a number of economists from the continent itself that are respected policymakers and thought leaders that would provide strategic advice and develop actionable recommendations to address the crisis. And therefore, one or three aspects that have been framed in the context of this panel is to explore and define the strategies that advance Africa's collective interests. Currently, we don't have a framework as a continent, and we're seeking at putting that forward. Increasing Africa's voice and representation in the global economic policy discussions. And thirdly, achieving a reformed and inclusive global economic system through the G20. And of course, knowing that almost 80% of the global economy is held by countries that form the G20. And the panel will therefore produce a high-level report outlining the key recommendations which will be presented to the G20 leaders and stakeholders. And earlier on, I think when the ambassador was opening, he was saying the issue of debt crisis is gaining momentum in discussions, but of course, we still think it's not been understood sufficiently by both the economists themselves that are involved in decision-making, and these efforts should seek to get this understanding at the highest level at the leaders summit. And finally, again, South Africa then would be hoping that the outcomes of the expert panel would particularly focus on crafting or putting forward a comprehensive plan that is not only just short-term, but looking at long-term on how to alleviate immediate debt burdens, but also lays a foundation for long-term economic stability and growth, including issues of private sector involvement, what role they should be playing, and knowing and understanding that we do have numbers of what is required to invest in Africa, if I use the area of food security, because I'm the ambassador and the permanent representative to the FAO, where we discuss food security issues. And in that context, the African continent has already developed, and the heads of states of the continent have a plan that is called CADAP, which was established, or at least decided during Malabo, and later on early this year, the heads of states concluded a new post-Malabo roadmap in terms of ensuring food sovereignty for Africa. And we have numbers that are indicating what investment would be required to at least achieve some level of food security for the African continent. And therefore, we can talk about even other aspects, whether it's connectivity in terms of the infrastructure, which already Italy and the European Union have crafted a framework working with the African Union on how best to make the African continent more connected in the context of its continental free trade area. So these are the key aspects that I thought I would highlight in the context of the South African G20 presidency. And of course, we know that solutions can be found where members are willing to explore those solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I think these points are incredibly crucial, and the fact that political willingness is key to design, accept, and implement the proposals that also the expert group that you mentioned is essential. Let me now shift to the online speakers, and I think Ambassador gave us the perfect assist to interact now with Pietrangelo Di Biase, who has been one of the main authors of a really relevant and interesting report by the OECD, which is called the Global Debt Report. Pietrangelo has been working particularly on the section on emerging and developing economies. So my question to you, Pietrangelo, would be the following. Could you please concentrate on the role of sovereign bond markets in emerging and developing economies amid these very challenging and adverse microfinancial conditions? Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for putting together this relevant event at this good timing, just prior to Sevilla meeting. I'm Pietrangelo Di Biase. I'm policy analyst at OECD, as introduced. I'd like to share the main insights from the Global Debt Report. Let me start telling you that this report was published in March. I am the main authors of the chapters on sovereign debt markets, both emerging markets and OECD, and I'm here to share the main insights from the emerging market chapter. I would like to start showing some big trends. And MD borrowing and debt has tripled since 2007. Borrowing, you can see on the left, has risen from around $1 trillion to around $2 trillion. And the debt from around $4 trillion to $12 trillion, outstanding bond debt. What's interesting to notice is that this increase was not driven by fiscal needs. Fiscal needs, according to the IMF of emerging market economies, remain largely around 4 to 6% of the GDP during this period. So this means that this increase was driven by market development. They developed their sovereign bond markets, especially in the beginning of the last decade, when rates globally were very low under a period of quantitative easing and accommodative monetary policy in the advanced economies. However, developing markets is quite good. It allows countries to have more independence. They reduce a dependency on donors, on bilateral lenders, and also on the terms of their borrowing, but it also brings some risks. So that was the slide that I previously showed. So just to illustrate the big increase in sovereign bond markets for 1 to 2 trillion in issuance, annual issuance on the left from emerging markets, and on the right, the stock from 4 to nearly 12, driven by development of markets. So going to my next slide is the costs. As you know, in 2022, finance conditions changed significantly with an increase in inflation in advanced economies, what prompted central banks to raise rates, and that has impacted markedly emerging markets, if not more than advanced economies. The stock of debt that was issued was mostly accumulated under a period of low rates, as you can see on the local currency rates on the left, and also on the foreign currency rates, actually USD denominated bonds on your right. However, now rates are much higher, meaning that stock of debt that was accumulated has been refinancing under higher rates, which leads to the problem of higher interest expenses that can have dire consequences. On the left, you can see the local currency bond market rates, and the main consequences of an increase in these rates is a reduction in the fiscal space for development and for social expenditures. On the right, you can see the rates on bonds denominated in US dollars, and they also reduce their fiscal space, but they can also bring problems in terms of currency, because these countries need to get these currencies to pay back their debt in the future. And with a rate of around 7% for lower and middle income countries, it's quite difficult to have to get this currency through exports and be able to finance their debt. It creates challenges. As a result of this, what we have seen is that international investors has reduced the exposure to emerging market economies. In this chart, you can see the net borrowing in foreign markets by emerging market issuers. Net borrowing means the amount issued less the amount redeemed. It's a proxy for how much of the debt increased in a given year. And you can see that since 2015, this value has been very positive, at least in 2022, in nearly all income groups. except low-income countries. However, after 2022, there has been a significant decline and also even negative net borrowing from markets. This means that foreign investors are investing less in MDs, likely because now they are able to have a real rate of return investing in risk-free US bonds or advanced economy bonds, while in the last decade they need to search for yield in emerging market economies, which makes it challenging with some EMDs losing access to markets and be able to pay their debt without re-rolling, which gives a big financial constraint and in some cases can even lead to default. That said, the credit, this difficult situation with higher debt, re-refinancing with higher yields, also follows a deterioration of credit quality since 2015, but especially following the COVID pandemic and the Ukraine crisis. On the left, you can see the number of EMD, the share of EMDs with a certain rate, only sovereign issues around 100 that we have. And you can see by looking at the blue bar on your left, that the blue bar is, the blue area, sorry, is on its highest level. Around 60% of our EMDs have a high risk or a very high risk of default. However, at the same time, if you look on the right, shows the share of the outstanding debt stock of the emerging market economies by credit ratings. And then it's the opposite trend. You can see that the blue area is the smallest it ever been. And the green ones mean the investment grade EMDs are largest. What explains this contrasting figure is that the large issuers, including China, India, Brazil, Mexico, Indonesia, Philippines, and so on, they are either investment grade or speculative grading. They are not high risk. And they were able to develop the local currency bond market over the past decades and have issued a lot. So this contrasts with past crises. In the 80s and 90s, when the US increased its rates, quite a few large issuers were in severe distress and defaulted, including Brazil, Peru, also Indonesia, and Thailand that I just mentioned. And the issue is that in this period, having large issues to default were risky for the financial stability of the global financial system. As a result, advanced economies, they supported. There was large restructuring going on. We have the Brady bonds in the 90s and so on, because it was a problem. It was visible. As Mr. Gentile mentioned, this crisis is more invisible, and that's one of the main reasons. The countries that have problems, they are mostly small economies. They're not able to develop the local currency bond markets. Just to give you an idea, the two largest economies in default, close to default, one is Ukraine, which is at war, and the other one is Ethiopia, which is, in terms of GDP, much smaller than the countries that I mentioned, China, India, Brazil, and so on. And however, these economies in default, currently or near default, they account for 5% of the global population. Only 1% of GDP, what's not that big, but 5% of the world population now lives in a country that is facing debt distress, which can have big social impact. That said, I'm gonna go to my last slide. We've just mentioned about the outlook and implications for this. Unfortunately, the outlook's not good. Already anticipating in a nutshell. Global funding conditions will likely remain tight. You can see even as this week, as we speak, the yields on US government bonds are reaching near decades high, so even higher than they were in 2023, when the peak of the tightening cycle. US dollar remains very appreciated despite declining liabilities at the beginning of this year, which increased the cost of foreign currency debt. And ODA, or Official Development Assistance, declined in 2024, about 7% decline, and expected, based on OECD surveys with donors, to decline further in 2025 by around 90 to 70%. So it's going to be a 2 years decline of more than 20%, very likely, in a period in which quite a few nations are needed to refinance their debt under higher rates, and the debt will build up under low rates. The implications for large emerging market economies that were able to develop local currency bond markets, they're going to have high interest expenditure, they pressure their budgets and slow their development. However, for small emerging market economies that don't have a local currency bond market, they might lose access to funding. And because of these, or even fund and prohibitively high costs. And in a situation with declining all the high geopolitical risks, and adverse macrofinancial conditions, they might face more risk of defaults, have social, or needs to spend out their, like, let's say, reduce drastically their expenditures in development, which might make the name slow down. At the same time, it's less likely now that you're going to have a broad support from advanced economies, given their impact in the global financial stability. I'll leave it there, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Pietrangelo. I think it was really important that you unpacked also the differences that we can see between large, small, medium, emerging and developing economies, and the challenges that each of them are facing, and also the fact that you mentioned on the reduction of ODA, which is likely to continue in the future, is really relevant and really impacts also the work that non-profit organizations are doing, which is crucial in development cooperation. And with this, I really would like to ask Christine to intervene. Christine, as also representative of Caritas Internationalis, is on the lead under this global campaign, which was launched recently, which is called Turn Debt into Hope. So could you please tell us more about the campaign and also your expectations around it, especially in view of the upcoming Jubilee report that was also mentioned in President Gentiloni's intervention. Please, Christine, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for hosting this fantastic event. It's so important. As our speakers and our distinguished panel members have already mentioned, debt relief is a vital issue. And I'm really keen, because President Gentiloni highlighted the importance of awareness raising and public opinion on this issue. We are, of course, in a very different political space than we were in the 1990s, as has always been also been highlighted. But that's why the Caritas Internationalis global campaign, Turn Debt into Hope, is so vital. This campaign seeks to bring that public opinion and a greater awareness raising to tackle the growing debt crisis that is crippling so many countries in the global south, which we've heard outlined already. I am not an economist, but those 54 countries that are in debt distress, that are spending more on debt repayment than on health or education, is absolutely critical if we are to build a more just and compassionate world. And as has been highlighted, those countries are honouring their debts, but it is at a huge cost in terms of the livelihoods, development of their peoples, and tackling climate change. Caritas Internationalis is the Church's response to emergencies and development. In that way, Caritas agencies are the people who are on that front line, responding directly to those millions of people around the world who are paying that price. The Vatican Commission of Experts, of which Martin, the panel member, is a member, is ensuring that we are well informed, and that the Pope, especially in his role as a global leader, is fully briefed. For us in this Jubilee year, it's really vital that we take action to ensure that funds can be released to build a more than just sustainable world. As has already been highlighted, this is never more necessary than now, when governments are cutting aid budgets, and yet we're way off track on our commitments to the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Accords, with less than 5 years to 2030. In this Jubilee year, as President Gentiloni highlighted, we're reminded that the pursuit of debt justice is a moral imperative and a measure of our common humanity. It's not just a question of liquidity or solvency. It is about the nature of the world that we seek. And Pope Francis reminded us that economic justice must prioritize human dignity over financial gain. He also referenced this concept of ecological debt, where wealthier nations who've benefited from the environmental resources of poorer countries are not compensating enough, which deepens global inequalities. So this campaign is launched by Caritas Internationalis Catholic actors, wider civil society organisations are involved too as part of this key Jubilee year. It's quickly gained momentum. We have got widespread interest and support, and it's been, certainly in the UK, a unifying call among a broad range of faith-based and civil society organisations that are committed to debt justice across the globe. Now, CAFOD as in the UK is particularly active because of the important role that UK law has in tackling private creditors. As is already flagged, the cost of debt is rising, and that's largely because private creditors can charge higher interest rates, and there's no constraints there. We've been taking action at a number of high-level events. We've had spring meetings at the World Bank, and we've had a meeting with the UN in Geneva, organised by the Holy See. We have got a side event planned for the Financing for Development conference in Seville, in order to bring this message from the Church, this moral imperative, alongside the economic and political analysis. But we're also engaging our people. We're engaging the Catholic community around the world through a petition, particularly. This is a way in which we try to bring and mobilize many thousands, hundreds of thousands of people to call for an end to this debt crisis. We've got a number of events taking place, but I want to flag the global petition, a petition that as individual organizations we're supporting too. A recent Caritas CAFOD report flagged the reality of the debt crisis felt by people and communities where we work, where we're supporting partners to respond directly to the needs. Sierra Leone, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Kenya. We had a partner from Kenya speak at a youth event to 10,000 young people about the reality of living in Kenya's debt situation, of and underemployment, of healthcare systems in crisis, and so on. So we have 3 asks for the petition: the immediate cancellation and restructuring of unjust and unsustainable debts without imposing harmful economic conditions, especially ones that fall on the poorest. We need long-term financial reform that prioritises people and the planet, creating systems that are fair, sustainable and free from predatory lending practices. And we support too the creation of a global debt framework and a debt workout mechanism under the UN, which is based on solidarity and harmony between peoples. This is very much in line with what the ambassador from South Africa talked about in terms of what the G20 is wanting to do, but we need to go further. We need to make sure, and that's why legislation is vital, that private creditors especially are brought in to this agenda. We're seeing, as we've said, as panelists have said, we've seen some improvements since the turn of the century, particularly impacted by the Jubilee debt campaign of the year 2000. But we've seen over the last 4 years, as has been highlighted, more people falling into poverty. We've seen that 2024 was recorded as the warmest year in history, and that's got catastrophic consequences for climate vulnerable nations. So as we work towards the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals and climate action, we know that we're still falling short. Progress is stalling. But financing for this sustainable development, for tackling climate change, is absolutely key. And we need to be able to find ways to bring that financing to the table. This is why debt restructuring is so, so vital. 25 years after the first Jubilee movement on debt relief, much still remains unfinished. We know that the nature of debt is different, the creditors are different, and we need to have the global structures in place to be able to tackle it. Because debt distress jeopardizes healthcare, education, clean energy, responses to the climate crisis. It is a matter for many of our partners and the people and communities that they work with. It's a matter of life and death. The principles of the Jubilee and the teachings inherent in Catholic social teaching act for us as guides for sustainable finance, so that we can drive forward the policy changes that are needed where debt, financial reform and sustainable development financing come together. It is a task for all of us, and the engagement of the faith community in this, alongside economic, climate leaders, politicians, and high-level decision makers, is really important that we all come together to mobilise. The Jubilee tradition calls for debt cancellation in affirming solidarity and justice. We have this opportunity to push for a new financial architecture, one that's human-centred, creative, based on equity, justice, and solidarity. Pope Leo said just last week to faith leaders that this is something that we must all work together for. We work together. I am convinced, he said, that if we're in agreement and free from ideological and political conditioning, we can be effective in saying no to war and yes to peace, no to the arms race and yes to disarmament, no to an economy that impoverishes peoples and the earth, and yes to integral sustainable development. Tackling debt is a key part of this, and we're so pleased to be part of these conversations, especially today. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. I think the work that you have been doing in terms of mobilization of thousands of people globally is really essential. And as you said, of course, we should never forget that those who are paying the highest price for this public crisis are the most vulnerable. So it's really important that with these campaigns, you really bring the voice of the last to the decision makers. Really look forward to following also your work and the side events you will be organizing in Sevilla at the end of June. Let me now turn to the panel in the room, and I think this was a great way to interact now with Penelope Hawkins, who plays a key role from different perspectives, I think, because on the one hand, UNCTAD produces the annual report for the UN Secretary General on external debt sustainability and development, which highlights the challenges that developing countries are facing. But she's also been supporting, as you would said, the UN expert group on debt. So based on your analysis, what is the latest debt situation in low and middle income countries? And especially, what are the key policy solutions that you are working on to address these challenges? Please, Penelope. Yes, we also have one slide from Penelope.
Thank you very much. From our perspective, we think that, and the interventions today, excuse me, have set it out that the situation is deeply disturbing by any measure. We know that we have the IMF who do this low-income debt sustainability analysis. They work on a group of countries that are known as the Poverty Reduction Growth Trust countries. And these are countries that are eligible for concessional finance. And they say that over half of these countries are in either debt distress or at very high risk of that. We also know the World Bank has been telling us for some time that we are in a silent debt crisis. And UNCTAD has been saying what we mean by that is that we are in a development crisis. So I think perhaps the latest data that we have really sets this out in very dramatic terms. We would say that we would actually say that neither the IMF or the World Bank are telling us the story as it really is. From our side, we think that their analysis, because it's focusing on these poverty reduction growth trust countries, is not broad enough in scope. Indeed, our data shows that countries have been stuck in a situation where their debt situation has been deteriorating since 2017. That's 8 years. Economists love to talk about a lost decade. There's one right there. We see that since we've had this crisis now, this particular slide, I'll speak to it in a minute. It's come on very early, so thank you. But the big point that we want to say is that 83% of developing countries for which we have data, that's 90 countries, have experienced a deterioration in both their external and their public debt situation since 2017. The biggest problem is that only 4 of them have actually moved into some kind of debt restructuring process through the common framework. They're all in Africa, those countries. And so where we see it is that the problem is much broader than we are led to believe, and also there is no exit route. Rather like that old Eagles song, Hotel California. You can check out anytime you want, but you can never leave. These countries have been stuck in this position since 2017. And what our data show, and I've got a story here where you can see the relative growth in exports, which are those dark bars, relative to the total external debt servicing costs of countries in those 3 groups. And you can see that for low-income countries and low-middle-income countries, the costs are outstripping their capacity to generate exports. In this environment, I have spoken about the London Agreement of 1953. The London Agreement of 1953 was around ensuring that Germany could emerge from the Second World War while honoring its debt repayments. And in the 1953 agreement, it was agreed that, first of all, half of Germany's debt was forgiven. And the second thing was that while Germany would have to repay the rest of its debt, it would only be required to pay up to the level of 5% of its export earnings. And that is because at the time it was judged reasonable that you can spend 5% of your export earnings on external debt, not everything. And if you look at the right-hand chart there, you can see the share at which this debt servicing is consuming export earnings. This is multiples of the London Agreement. And this, if I may remind you, is in 2024. This is before Liberation Day. So we cannot anticipate that things improve. We must assume these costs that have risen so dramatically have done so because these countries in these groups have reached a wall of debt. They've had to refinance, and as our colleague from the OECD pointed out, they had to refinance at a much higher rate. So we are stuck in this situation. How do we move on from that? The way we see this is that lower middle income countries and low income countries in particular are actually are not defaulting on debt service, but they are defaulting on development. And as has been discussed elsewhere, this has implications for the populations of those countries. This 3.3 billion people that we talk about is not an insignificant part of the human race. And it's that, in fact, that prompted the United Nations Secretary General to establish the Debt Expert Group, of which President Gentiloni is a co-chair. As the Secretariat, we have spoken about how one can deal with this crisis. And we identify 4 routes going forward. Obviously, one needs to reduce the cost of new debt. One needs to find a way of providing a larger amount of debt because, as has been discussed earlier today, this is not about the stock growing so quickly. This is about the cost growing so quickly. The cost has outstripped the growth of the stock 4 times. So this is not countries gorging on debt. No, this is the costs rising dramatically, and these countries are price takers. So we need to find ways to reduce the cost of new debt. We need to find ways of increasing the provision of longer-term debt that matches the development imperative. The problem is that if you are getting money from the markets at 7 years, but what you're using it for is to invest in your education system, there is a huge mismatch. You cannot receive the rewards of that investment before you have to repay the markets. We need to find ways to reduce the cost of existing debt and reduce the scale of existing debt, particularly this expensive debt. So as President Gentiloni had pointed out, we've tried to categorize these areas in 3 different tracks. First of all, we think they are multilateral measures. They are things that need to be done by the international financial order. Then there are country-level actions, but they require coordination. They require countries to work together, particularly countries of the South. And then we need countries to do things for themselves. So they are national measures. We've had to take into account key dependencies. Of course, it's all very well to say we need more, cheaper, long-term debt. But then how do you get that? It's something that we all talk about, and we acknowledge the G20, Italian G20 presidency, which spoke about, for the first time, the capital adequacy framework for multilateral development banks, and set us on a roadmap to discuss this in the G20. But key to that, apart from the investments that the MDBs themselves, the multilateral development banks themselves can undertake, we need to have new ways of funding them. New recapitalizations, new SDRs, gold sales by the IMF. All of these are possibilities, but are they possibilities now? And this has been part of the problem, that we've tried to look at these. We've identified something like 136 possibilities, and we've passed them through this lens of, are they politically feasible? Will they have short-term impact? Because we do need to do something in the short term. And what will be the scale of their impact? And so in this space, we have identified a number of things. Of course, there is the capital adequacy framework that I've already mentioned. There is the addressing of the G20 shortcomings, as President Gentiloni already mentioned. Then there is looking at really changing the debt sustainability analyses that much more are sensitive to the development needs of countries. The problem with the current set of debt sustainability analyses is that they are designed from the perspective of the creditor. So what will it take for you to repay? Not what will it take for you to come back from the edge of the cliff, and how do we push you back from the edge of the cliff so you can go on to a development path? So these are things that need to change. In terms of the country-level actions that require coordination, there are several things. The Borrowers Club or Borrowers Forum is one. We think this is a kind of space where borrowers can inform each other and share experiences, that they can develop the synergies on things around debt swap platforms, and also that they can teach each other around the benefits of true capacity to manage their debt, to empower their debt management officers. And then at the national level, one of the biggest things, of course, that countries need is some kind of investment platform that they need to develop and maintain, so that should there be this association of the private markets in this space, there is something for them to go to. There is also this issue that we think is very crucial, is continued and upgraded communication with markets. At the Springs meeting, I shared a panel with somebody who was representing the bond holders. And she was saying, it's so important for us to get transparency from the countries in which we have invested. We are now looking at possibly offering them the incentive of reducing the coupon rate if they provide transparent information for 4 years. On year 5, we will give them a discount. This issue of communicating with the markets is so important. Of course, they have to communicate too with the credit rating agencies. But the reality is that unless we have better communication, we can know more and more about the credit rating agencies' methodology. But unless they feel that there is a credible strategy around development communicated to them, it's not going to change the ultimate rating. And so I will leave it there just to say that there is, of course, the process involving the expert group is such that we are completing a final document for them, and this will be available, we're making it available to the SG Guterres still within the first half of June, and it will be part of the Sevilla process. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Penelope. And I think this issue of better communicating the case for development and the case for investing in development is really crucial. And I read with super great interest among other publications that you led, really the report on credit rating agencies and the bias towards developing countries. I really encourage the public to have a look at it. I will now pass the floor to Martin Kessler. Finance for Development Lab is one of the leading think tanks working on debt solutions and also on innovative financial solutions to debt sustainability. And with you, Martin, I wanted to address the issue of the climate debt trap, because low-income countries are facing multiple challenges, mounting the pressures, but also increased vulnerability to climate change shocks. And of course, all these climate-related disasters are forcing these nations to borrow at very high cost for recovery, worsening, and this is worsening, of course, your debt situation. So what could be innovative financing mechanisms to support these countries from this double climate debt trap?
Thanks a lot, and thanks a lot for the invitation, and thanks a lot for putting me last, which means that I have less to say. Much has been said, so I have less things to say, and I'll try to take this lens of the joint climate and nature and biodiversity and debt crisis in low and lower middle income countries. So the Finance for Development Lab is a think tank based in Paris, an independent think tank. And we have been part with other organizations of the Secretariat of an expert group called the Independent Expert Review on Debt, Climate and Nature. And so we're experts and a secretariat with ODL Global in London, the think tank Asset in Ghana, and the UN Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. So together we've been helping a group of experts in trying to craft a report which was commissioned by Kenya, Colombia, France, and Germany, and help the global system think about those interactions of the mounting debt pressures, and as you were saying, what was characterized in the first interim report as a vicious circle of debt and climate. So and you know what you described is right. There's higher debt pressures which lead to reduced ability to invest. To first spend on health, education, but also invest in climate adaptation. And if you believe the scenarios that are produced from the warming scenarios and then the consequences on the economies, we have very large costs for economies that are in the global south because they suffer more from global warming and biodiversity and the loss in biodiversity. The estimates that we have are very imprecise because because we don't know enough, but it's something between 15, 20, 25% of loss in GDP relative to a world without climate warming. And that's really even in the moderate climate warming scenarios. And so those are really macro-critical evolutions. And so, they will, it's natural disasters, yes, but also the slow onset of land erosion, of loss in agricultural productivity in countries that are very dependent on agriculture. So all of that will deteriorate economic prospects, which will lead to debt crisis. And the fact that there's already a lot of pressure on debt, which we talked about a lot already, means that there's very little ability to invest today. And so that's really the vicious circle that we are dealing with. And the approach, the solution that were proposed in the report are in several categories. One is first, let's fix the diagnostics. The leading diagnostic for the set of countries are the debt sustainability analysis. And I will not get into the technical details of the different diagnostics. There's one type of framework which is addressed for low-income countries, low and lower middle-income countries, another one for countries that have more access to markets, access to bond markets. They're very different. But I think the common problem is that they do not consider enough the impact of climate change and biodiversity on the ability to, on the economy, on growth, and then on the ability to repay debt. Which means that you have the paradox where countries that could invest and be more resilient in the long run are prevented from doing so. It's seen as a cost. In the short term, you have to spend to invest and you have to borrow to invest. And that improves your long-term sustainability, that improves your solvency, but in the short term, it's a cost. And so what you see in the current diagnostics is that it deteriorates the assessed debt situation. So fixing those diagnostics, allowing for to show that when you invest in your economy, it has return and it can improve the profile of your debt. So fixing the diagnostic is the first part. The second is that through this, taking this into account, this ability to invest for future climate change, you need to reform the debt restructuring frameworks to adapt to allow for that. Which means that in some cases, currently, when you restructure debt, as Penelope said, you're put back on the brink. You try to target a level. You negotiate with the creditors, and you try to target a level where you're back to sustainability, but just so in a way. You kind of can handle some shocks. If some future shocks happen, you're not back immediately to unsustainability, but the country is still very close to a place where it's very hard to invest. So what we show in the report is that if you give more space to invest in resilience, actually it's in the benefits of everybody, including creditors, will give more relief in the short run, but against the ability of countries to invest in their resilience and some more long-run sustainability. So creditors will give up a bit more in the short run, but the country has a lot less probability to fall back into debt stress, which is very costly for both the debtor country and the creditors. So based on those climate-informed DSAs, debt sustainability analysis, you can have debt restructuring with objectives, including investment in resilience and the protection of nature. For that, you need better data. You need to be able to track more climate impacts, also the impact of the policies and the investment against climate shocks. So there's a lot of investment, both from countries and from international institutions, in being able to assess those investments and make those investments. I think that the role of the World Bank and President Gentiloni was referring to the speech of the U.S. Treasury Secretary, was saying, let's talk less about climate change. In this case, climate change is very critical for growth, for macroeconomy. It's the same thing. There's no difference between adaptation and development in those contexts where there's a lot of vulnerability. So that's improving the diagnostics. being able to take into account those needs when you do a debt restructuring, and in cases where there's no obvious need for restructuring, but where the immediate weight of debt service is very high, provides the ability for refinancing operations. So lengthening maturity provides fiscal space in the short run, and this fiscal space can be used to do those investments. Last point, I don't know how much time, but the last point is on this question of something that Gentiloni was also mentioning on debt swaps. And more broadly, I would take a broader lens and on operations of, let's say, financial engineering to improve the profile of developing countries and their ability to repay. I think there's two, so it's a bit broader than swaps, and I'll go to two main categories. First, we need to develop instruments that will help countries have to match the profile of reimbursement capacity of countries to their growth. What do I mean by that? In a lot of, currently most bond contracts are very insensitive to what's happening in the country and in the world, which means that when you have a natural disaster, you have a loss in the ability to pay, but your need to repay, it remains the same. You can draw maybe a little bit more from World Bank, from the IMF, but the debt service is very inflexible. So designing contracts that will allow to reduce debt payment during times of shock is very important. The World Bank has adopted, in some cases, such clauses. A few bilateral creditors have done so as well. We need a lot of push for private contracts to include them. Because, as was said, they make majority of debt repayments currently. If possible, by changing debt contracts in current contracts, it's very hard, but at least making that adopt progressively in new contracts. So that's a change in the profile of debt repayment. Second, debt swaps. So debt swaps are a way, there's a lot of operation in the debt swap. There's one word, but there's several operations that tend to be complex operations, and I think that's why it's very useful to have a capacity building platform explaining when and how to use them. There's basically three operations within one. First, there's a guarantee from a highly rated entity. So you get a guarantee to take a new loan that allows to borrow at low cost, even if you're considered as risky by markets. So first, the guarantee. Then a buyback of existing debt, which is expensive. That's the second operation. The existing debt is expensive. The new debt is less expensive. That's the difference between the two, which you can allocate, and that's the third operation. You kind of commit to allocate it to a sustainability objective. The sustainability objective can improve your long-run economic and environmental sustainability because you invest more. So having those three operations together helps because you signal to the market that you are credible. You do allocate new spending to a sustainability objective. They tend to be very complex and very expensive in terms of there are a lot of financial intermediaries which all take a fee, and that's the problem, and that's I think where capacity building is very important to lower the transaction costs. The World Bank has shown with Côte d'Ivoire, I think it was mentioned, there was a transaction in Côte d'Ivoire which was much simpler, went through the budget of the government. Usually they go through NGOs, and so went directly to the priorities of the government. And I think that's a good way to show that we can improve the operation. And those will not solve the debt crisis for the crisis for countries that have very high levels of debt, but they can improve both the perception, and I think perception and risk perception is very important in those cases to lower the cost of debt, improve perception, and they can make sure that new flows are allocated to those sustainability objectives. I'll answer that. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin, for highlighting and unpacking also the bottlenecks that are at the basis and at the core of the difficulties around the, let's say, full issuing and full harnessing of the debt for development swaps. I think this is very much needed, and this is why think tanks like Financing for Development Lab are crucial, because they also provide, with the support of of the work conducted by international and multilateral organizations, the technical tricks to make sure that these solutions can be fully implemented. We have 10-15 minutes for Q&A. I've already collected one from the audience online, but we may collect one, two, sorry, questions or comments in the room for our speakers, and then I will give all of you the chance to answer in the remaining time. So please, if you want to intervene, introduce yourself. There is already one question at the end of the room. Yes, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Francesca Utili, Minister of Economy and Finance. And let me thank Penelope for mentioning the G20 effort on capital adequacy framework, which indeed led to extraordinary results well beyond expectation in making MDBs having much more room of maneuver. But looking at today's agenda, I wanted to highlight another initiative that Italy had put forward during the G7 presidency last year, and that was discussed also in outreach meeting with G20, Troika, and the African Union, the presidency of the African Union, Mauritania, which involved a comprehensive three-pillar approach, including domestic resource mobilization, coordinated contribution by multilateral development banks, and measures of reprofiling and incentives for the private sector. And that would be mainly aimed at countries whose debt was at risk of debt distress, but sustainable. So I was wondering whether in your reflection you have also included reflection of this kind that would involve putting together several measures in a concrete package that could be maybe applied to some pilot cases. So just whether this sort of approach is within the range of your reflections for the experts. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And the work that the Ministry of Finance has done during the G7 presidency was incredible. So thanks a lot for the question that you raised. Are there other questions in the room? If not, I already collected one from an online participant, Marco De Ponte, CEO of EVOS, which is an international organization working a lot with the CSOs in the Global South in several regions. Marco is asking all our speakers, I think you can all intervene on this point, what tools are available to force the reluctant governments and private creditors to come to an agreement on let's say, addressing this development, this debt sustainability and debt trap issue. So I think I can ask all speakers to intervene on that. I don't see, there are also two questions in the room, so we can collect them, and then I will go back to all the speakers online and in the room. Yes, please, introduce yourselves.
Thanks. Maurizio Navarra, I am the coordinator of the Global Donor Platform for Rural Development. I'm hosted by IFAD. We're all preparing for Seville in a way. All sectors are preparing for Seville, and we're all developing the narrative and advocacy plans for our own sectors now, building on, the cost of inaction and how important it is to increase financing for a specific sector. Now, that is clearly something that is cross-sectoral and actually impinges on the development of other sectors. I mean, we don't have to explain that. Now, in terms of outcomes, not only of Seville, but also outcomes that will consolidate and crystallize over the next 2-3 years. And the question I'm addressing is for UNCTAD. I really loved your presentation and actually the way also it was gearing attentions towards things that we didn't know. What do you think is concretely feasible? I love the way you exposed potential actions and way forward for the community to respond to this. We know the political environment is extremely complicated. So what is feasible, the 2-3 areas that you sense are going to be feasible politically, not only in Seville, but also going forward? Thanks.
Thank you so much. We have one other question here and two. So one and then two. Yes.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Alfonso Apicella from Caritas Internationalis. I'm Senior Officer for Global Advocacy Campaigns. Together with Christine, I'm leading the Jubilee Debt campaign, Turn Debt into Hope. I was really interested and intrigued by the point that was also discussed during the Washington DC spring meetings a few weeks ago with you, Penelope, in particular. The cooperation among borrowers that President Gentiloni was mentioning, and also the possibility of creating a borrowers club, how does that work? So what would the best mechanism be for that? And also what's the role for that in terms of the civil society, commitment, and the African Union in particular? Thank you.
Thank you, Alfonso. One last question.
Thank you so much. My name is Sharif Dawood, and I'm a first secretary in the Embassy of Egypt. First of all, allow me to thank all the presenters for the very informing presentations. I might not have a clear question, but I have telegraphic points to mention from a perspective of a country that is struggling with its debts and a country that is a middle-income country, which is actually putting more pressure on us. Because right now, the first thing I would like to start with, there is a more increasing focus towards least developed countries, low-income countries, while the middle-income countries are the countries that are more struggling. They have the highest levels of debts, they have the highest level of population growth, and they have the highest level of opportunity. So that's one thing that needs to be considered. One of the elements I would like to also to highlight that was mentioned by the esteemed presenter from UNCTAD is the issue of I'm calling it the debt taxonomy, the classification between the short-term and the longer-term debts, because that's also one of the challenges that we are facing in our countries. It's the question that we need to get short-term debts for funding longer-term projects, including education, infrastructure, that are highly needed by our countries to bridge the gap that is already existing while we are not able to do this as per the current conditions of the debts. A key word also I'd like to focus about is resilience. I'm giving an example by my country. Like we have got through the shock of the COVID, followed by the Russian-Ukrainian war, while we are a net importer for food, followed by the war in the Middle East, followed by the war in Sudan, followed by the escalation in Libya. So whatever efforts are done at the national level needs to support at every time the concept of resilience. And it's very difficult to support this concept in such an international complicated situation we are facing right now. I would conclude, not to take much of your time, by the question of climate finance, where we are facing two clear challenges here I'd like to sum on. The first is the issue of the access to finance. Again, the money is theoretically there, but to get access to this money by developing countries, it's an extremely complicated process. I don't want to walk you through the processes of the Green Climate Fund, of the Global Environment Facility, among others, that is extremely complicated for the developing countries. And the second is that there is an absolute lack of balance between the funding for climate mitigation and climate adaptation. While climate adaptation is a priority for developing countries, including food security, water scarcity, among others, it is paid by the national budgets of the countries because there is no tendency to fund these projects. If they are funded by loans, not by grants, and there is no balance between the two concepts, a 50-50 balance in the different funding mechanisms. For example, if you compare the budget of the Green Climate Fund to the Adaptation Fund, you will discover the difference. And most of the time, the innovative solutions are calling for markets. It's carbon markets, it's carbon bonds, which are extremely difficult. We don't have the legal infrastructure for that. It needs a lot of capacity building. And finally, it has higher reporting burden that makes it much more expensive than getting the money from the commercial markets. I thank you and I apologize for taking the floor for long.
Thank you so much. So if you allow me, I will start from Penelope because she was addressed several questions. And then I go to Martin and then to our speakers online. Can I please ask you to be brief, 1-2 minutes maximum for your... I know the questions are really complicated, but we also have some time here after the event to further discuss them. Thank you.
So thank you so much. The fabulous questions, and I'm sorry we don't have enough time to really engage with them. I think perhaps I could start with Francisca's question. I think this idea of a package is absolutely essential. I think where we are still concerned is this issue of adequately identifying where this package could be initially, shall we say, piloted. And part of that is because we are really concerned about, while we understand this push for DRM, and all countries know they have to do more. In this current environment and the data that we're looking at now, if we push for ambitious domestic resource mobilization targets, we are in fact imposing austerity on countries that are not growing. And so it really is a very difficult balance. It's a very important stance, and it is important to have it as part of the package. But maybe it's a question of sequencing. Maybe we first need to be doing the brief profiling, and we need to be doing that really on a concerted effort. Let's do more local currency lending. Let's convert the maturity so it's much longer. Then we can start to move into that direction of the other parts of the package. The MDBs are crucial for so much of what we have been discussing. There was a question around what can be done to force the markets. I don't know that there's really very much we can do to force the markets. But I think if we were to look seriously at the common framework, we know that if we have an example of, say, corporate insolvency, the rules of corporate insolvency are, first of all, there is a standstill. Then there is an examination of the perimeter of legitimate debt. And then the process starts working down in terms of cramming down the outcome. We're doing the common framework without that first step. And so if a country is continuing to pay the creditors throughout, there is much less pressure for them to stop being intractable. There were some lovely questions around, what are the outcomes, the concrete outcomes, and also the story around the Borrowers' Forum. Perhaps I can just combine them here. I think there is, the one thing that we are seeing is that there's really an engagement from some of the larger creditor countries that have been taking quite a bad rap in recent years. I don't think we're going to get some of those countries to give debt relief in terms of a reduction of net present value. But they are engaging around this issue of we can extend the maturity to 20 to 30 years. If we have enough of that, it really can make a difference, and I think there's some space for that as a concrete outcome. This issue of the Borrowers' Forum is really crucial. We have many creditors' forums. This is a Borrowers' Forum. We have, as UNCTAD, been holding meetings with borrowers on the sidelines of various international conferences. What we see in those spaces is that borrowers are very keen to learn, they're very keen to engage with experts, with creditor countries, but they want their own space to define what it is that they want to talk about. And so I think there is a real potential for us to work forward some kind of umbrella forum. There are plenty of short-term and half-existing borrowers' clubs out there. We're not suggesting this has to be a monolithic structure, but we are saying there may be strength in having a permanent secretariat that supports such a thing. And then the point that was raised so eloquently by our colleague from Egypt, the problem that we have is unless we do enough, to Francisca's point, unless we have a package that really pushes us forward, including for the middle-income countries, is that what we are doing is that we're just continuing to keep this dying, emaciated man on some kind of drip feed so that he continues to breathe. But we've got to get this corpse up. We've got to get them walking and dancing and singing. And so we need much more concerted effort. We will talk more later. Thank you.
Thank you, Penelope. Martin?
Yes, thank you. Maybe I'll take the first question on this idea of a three-pillar approach. I think it's absolutely essential. There's so the common framework, very imperfect processes. We need a lot of fixing to fix the restructuring process. But at the same time, it has a stigma. So it means that a lot of countries that or in this in-between that have flows problem to reimburse, that are forced to reduce their development expenditure, will not go to such a process because it's long, because it means there's a few years was excluded from market. Something like the three-pillar approach, I think, could be strengthened with clearer frameworks, with clearer timelines, but it is very important in allowing countries that have more flow problems to be able to invest, to be able to avoid what's happening now, which is that a lot of IMF and multilateral development banks financing goes to reimburse existing creditors, and that means that the money, development, very scarce investment for development is going out of the country instead of being invested in growth. And I think that's a basic principle of the three-pillar approach. Again, I think that's, for now, there's a little bit of lack of clarity for developing countries to kind of go forward and kind of adopt this approach. But making it clearer, highlighting it in the G20, I think are very important, and the lab, the Defense for Development Lab, which we've been working on, has done a number of papers to kind of push such an approach. So completely support it and its extension. I think I'll take the question on the kind of what are the new models of financing for development in the context of the loss of IDA, especially on IFAD, and since we're in Rome, I think the UN organizations. I think that there's a major challenge with the reduction in grants and ODA grants. So we really need to rethink very deeply the model of development finance through institutions that are primarily supported by grants, and go towards ways to finance that are innovative. So use of SDRs. There's some institutions that are SDR prescribed holders that could find a way to use them. Hybrid capital, there's a lot of talk about using them to support hybrid capital. It's been very difficult, but using SDR bonds, so ways that are closer to things that, so the problem with hybrid capital is that central banks are not used to hybrid capital, and central banks are the ones have the SDRs. So SDR bonds, which will have long maturities, stable and low interest rates, where central banks could use their reserve to buy them and to support, to have this kind of all the safety necessity for reserve assets, and support, UN institutions that want those, and multilateral development banks. So we need to be very innovative, and I think institutions that not necessarily needed to be very innovative now need to turn from the model of grant financing to new ways of borrowing and investing. That's the big shift in the software of these institutions, but I don't think there's much of a choice in the context of a complete reduction in the grants available, especially towards multilateral projects.
Thanks, Martin. Christine, and then Pietrangelo for your final remarks.
Thank you so much. There's a huge amount that has been said that's very positive. I'm particularly appreciative of all of Penelope's input. I think I wanted to just comment very briefly about the fact that we do need to work at lots of different levels. It's why we're supporting the Vatican high-level experts commission, bringing that moral imperative at that high level. But why the Global Caritas campaign is important is that it's also about making sure that ordinary people are ensuring and influencing their politicians to be able to create some of that political space for some of these debates. And in the UK, as I mentioned, that's particularly around private creditors legislation to kind of impact on that. So I think it's really important that we do work at a number of different levels to try and bring these things together, which is one of the reasons why we're so pleased to have been part of today. And I am so sorry, but I actually have to leave pretty much straight away. So thank you very much for a really fascinating and interesting morning.
Thank you, Christine. Pietrangelo? Thank you.
I'll start talking about what I believe is crucial in the long run, which is the development of local currency bond markets, so that these countries are not need to borrow from foreign currency, which is one of the major drivers of this crisis. And on that ground, some large issues were able to, small issue was not able to. There's quite more that can be done in that front for international organization in terms of capacity building, also in terms of helping a gradual development of local small markets. This cannot be something that is done fastly, because most of the debt of low income, the low and middle income countries, not most, but a big chunk is concessional. They cannot simply reissue at market rate to be much higher. So there is a case for graduality in development of local currency bond markets for in the future. They are able to they are able to mitigate the impact of crisis on there. And second, I'd like to bring is the question specifically on to force reluctant governments and creditors to get a deal. And I'll start to mention that I'll not use the word force. I think it's when you try to force, it could lead to issues. I can see that the most famous case on sovereign debt is Argentina, I believe, and you can see that during 2 moments in Argentina, we had a very reluctant borrower, and then at the other side, after 10 years or so, we have a very reluctant lender. And it was only resolved after rounds and rounds and rounds and rounds and rounds of discussions. This case of Argentina built the whole sovereign debt system. Now we have CACs, collective action clauses. It's much more easier for creditors it's more difficult for creditors to hold out. But what seems to be needed is much more coordination. The common framework is new. The IMF and World Bank acknowledge it as a work in progress. And the way that it was designed, the information sharing doesn't start strongly at the start. We have information sharing more afterwards, after some DSA is made. Is not that interactive, and that's not. I'm not speaking on behalf of the OECD. OECD does not do work on this. That's on behalf on what I've seen from the discussion of the IMF and the World Bank themselves saying. So what is being needed is on intensify the discussions in the common framework with creditors, which could, of course, benefit from various measures, including having a foreign or borrowers club, as mentioned by Penelope and other speakers, to make the coordination as much as possible more interactive, so no borrower or creditor is reluctant. So we need to avoid the reluctancy rather than try to pursue for the enforcement. That's how I'll end my intervention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pietrangelo. Let me ask the audience online and in presence to join me in a big round of applause for our speakers, who really gave us important insights on a very complex topic. So with this, I would like to end by giving the floor to my colleague Ettore Greco, who will conclude this meeting. Thank you so much for participating and for engaging in this event.
Many thanks, Daniele. Good morning, everyone. I will be, I promise, extremely brief. I think this debate has been indeed very rich, inspiring, and also thought-provoking, certainly. So it would be an exercise in futility try to summarize it. I think it has offered also a variety of perspectives, so allowing us also to compare those perspectives. This is very important when we undertake this effort to examine very complex and multifaceted issues. I think it's been an opportunity to discuss and look into the state of play of the debt crisis, but also the major contributing factors and drives and how they have evolved over time. Also the outlook, so the prospect of these trends, how they can develop in the future, and not least important, of course, the proposals that are on the table, those that are being developed, and we expect to be discussed extensively at the upcoming Seville conference. I think our general broad effort should be to try as much as possible to contribute to raise awareness of the seriousness and urgency of the debt crisis in low and middle income countries. Also, its far-reaching implication for the international financial system. And the prospects of development of the heavily indebted countries and the implementation of the UN 2030 agenda. As Gentiloni at the beginning emphasized, this awareness is clearly inadequate, is largely insufficient, so this task is particularly important. I would say also because attention, we can say, has decreased over time because of other crises, other development of the international scene that, of course, both diplomacy, policymakers have looked at, and the risk, of course, that this continues to remain in the background, while we know there is a strong interconnection between all these developments. So I think our first task is to examine and assess what is the problem per se. The volume of debt, that has been said, has increased, but particularly we see not only and not so much the volume of debt itself, but the problem of the rising cost of debt services, and also the growing difficulties of access to financial market, and this has to do also with other complex dynamics in the financial system. And this is having, of course, a very impact on the prospect of development in mostly in the heavily indebted countries. As I think Mrs. Hawkins has said, those countries are defaulting not so much on debt, they are doing their best in a sense to honoring the debt and to preserve their financial reputation, but this is having a very negative adverse effect on the resources that they can devote on their development. So that's the first task for our researchers, to understand better the situation, the state of play. But second, not least important and not less complex, is to understand how the current trends and also the new trends, the recent international developments, are impacting on this problem. So the rise of protectionism, the escalating trade tension, and the heightening geopolitical tension, which of course are exacerbating, heightening the debt issue. And of course, we should also take into consideration that the policies being implemented at the moment, that some fateful decisions made by several decision makers are having also a very negative impact. And this applies not only, of course, to the US, but also to Europe. So we should take into account also these relatively recent developments and how they are developing, because, of course, this has a huge impact. The third task is try to promote a dialogue on the possible solutions and proposals. As has been said, all eyes will be on the proceedings and deliberation at Seville, and this will be most probably, of course, the center of gravity of international tensions for some days. And this is a crucial opportunity to discuss also the reform financing at all levels, including also possible reform on international architecture that, as you know, has been discussed for several years, but now the prospect of really implementing reforms have been reduced because of the developments I just mentioned. So the debate will be on financing challenges from the implementation of the UN 2030 agenda, the debt crisis itself, but also the reform of international financial institutions. It's very important what Gentiloni said at the beginning, the three different flows that we have been able to discuss, reprofiling of the debt, the possibility of having new form of debt swaps and also conversion in local currencies, and of the problem that's been extensively discussed of the changing and possibly lengthening the debt maturity. These are all key elements of possible package, but also there has been talk also on the possibility of reforming the G20 common framework, which has been considered a big achievement in a sense, an important step for the G20, but now debate is very much focusing and has been developing on the need for a revision to enhance the mechanism, but also to change it. And there are indeed some concrete proposals to that effect that need to be promoted or at least discussed extensively. And then, of course, the collaboration between borrowing countries. The picture has dramatically changed in the last few years. We know the balance also has changed, so there is the need to cooperate, try to cooperate, to promote cooperation with such actors as China. There are some few non-particularly successful examples of this attempt, but this is in any case an effort that should be furthered. And of course also the need to involve also other actors, and I think the Seville conference could be a very important opportunity, an inclusive platform involving also civil society organization, also representative of business entities. There are many events and meetings and dialogue, and it's important to stress again the role that such initiatives as the Jubilee Initiative can play in this regard, in this context. This is the type of dialogue that also we as an institute feel to be committed to promote. We have a line of research specifically focused on Europe and the role of Europe. Perhaps we should have discussed even more the role of Europe, but it remains very important through our cooperation with the ETTG, so we will continue to do that. And also, of course, our horizon primarily embraces the UN, the role of UN agencies, UNCTAD, etc. And we will discuss the problem of debt in conjunction while discussing the other lines of research that we are trying to develop, so food security, global issues such as global health and green transition. Those who follow our activities could have noted that we have been expanding our activities on those very relevant global issues. And finally, also the national dimension. We are keenly interested in trying to promote a wider debate, a more informed debate on the possible role of Italy, taking into consideration the effort that the country is making to develop its cooperation, particularly with Africa, through the Mattei Plan. There will be several initiatives in the coming months of the Institute, particularly on the Mattei Plan and the role of Italy, in always, of course, in trying to have an exchange of views and exchange of experiences and practices with other countries and the role of international organization. So we will keep you informed on our activities, future events and publication in cooperation with our partners. I wish again to thank Focus 2030, the Fondazione Compagnia di San Paolo Turin and the Centro Studi per il Federalismo. So again, thank all of you for being with us today, and we very much look forward to furthering our discussion, our conversation in the coming months.